with an overview of the Iranian American community in the U.S. and will elaborate on some of the historical characteristics, and then we'll later on discuss the implications of these for the language maintenance in the Iranian American language community, heritage community. So the presence of the Iranian American community is marked by recentness. In fact, in the Iranian immigrants are very recent compared to other language communities. It started in two waves. The first wave was between the 1950s and 1970s. This era was marked by a strong Iran-US relationship during the Pahlavi dynasty, and it was at the time that this particular dynasty started a rapid modernization, authoritarian modernization, and there was a huge need for experts and trained individuals, and US was a destination of choice for many students. And some came to the US, some stayed, some went back. Mostly would go back to Iran. So by the end of 1970s, the number of Iranians living in the US was around almost 100,000 people. Sorry. It's because of, lack of eyesight, sorry. The second wave was after 1979 up to present. This was right after the Iranian Revolution, and because of the social upheaval and political turmoil, there was a significant exodus of Iranians to the US for various reasons: political, religious, cultural, and this exodus is ongoing, and many Iranians have come to the US ever since, mostly for educational reasons and political reasons, according to a survey done by Zaghi institution in 2008. The number of Iranians, again, according to US Census Bureau, is around 470,000 people. So there has been a 250% increase over the past 40 years. I have to say that this number is debatable. There are various figures for the number of Iranians. Some estimate suggests that they number around between 1 million to 1.5 million, and there are various reasons for that. One of them is that the Iranians are reluctant to identify as Iranians. Lack of participation in the census, so there is discrepancy in the numbers. We have a figure by the Iranian Interest Section Office in Washington, D.C., which says it has issued 900,000 passports to Iranians in the U.S. So it's debatable. And if we include the number of Afghan immigrants in the U.S., it numbers, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, around 90,000. Then the number, again, fluctuates further. So that's the number. So it's very recent. It's certainly not among the 10 most populous immigrant community in the U.S. So this recentness has implications for the language maintenance, which I will elaborate further if later on during the discussions. So the Iranian American community breakdown in terms of age group, according again to a recent study by Bozorgmer in 2012, is as follows: 56% first generation, 34% second generation, and 10% the generation 1.5. So we are not in the territory of language loss in the third generation and fourth. So we are talking about very recent community. In terms of education and economic attainments of Iranian Americans across different age groups and both genders, their higher education attainment levels are twice the national average, 60% versus 30% roughly, again according to US Census Bureau in 2010. In terms of average income, the median household income is again significantly higher than the national average. The median household income is about 60K versus 42K national. Median family income around 70K versus 50K for the national population. In terms of geographic concentration of Iranian Americans by state and region, California comes first by far. Then comes Texas, New York, Virginia, Maryland. In terms of region, if we consider other Iranians in other states, other than these 5 that I just mentioned, they are in Northwest 12%, Midwest 6%, South 25%, West 56%. So in terms of attitude toward Persian language and culture in the Iranian American community, the few surveys that have been done suggest they are very ethnic. They have a strong ethnic identity, are proud of their past and history. Generally, they have a strong connection to the language and culture. They have a rich literary history, which they are very proud of. Iranian Americans are said to subscribe to the so-called ideology of elite bilingualism, which means that they believe bilingualism is in itself a value, an asset. It's other than utilitarian purposes. They believe in additive rather than subtractive bilingualism, biculturalism, and because of this attitude, they tend to advocate Persian language maintenance by their children. 80% of Iranian Americans speak Persian at home, according to the US Census Bureau again. Many families enforce Persian-only policy to varying effects and success. Many send their kids to Saturday schools or cultural centers for language maintenance, which kids very fondly refer to as the torture school.
Madam, I'm within my time or?
In terms of challenges faced by the Iranian American community regarding their heritage language maintenance, the most important thing is the lack of support by the public school system, especially in the greater DC area. Persian is not on the curriculum, and we all know that as soon as kids go to school, it's the most determining factor in the start of language shift and loss. Unfortunately, Persian is not supported on that front. The current animosity between Iran and the US does not really help to foster positive attitude in some Persian family kids toward Persian, and then which has some consequences for their willingness to take up Persian. Because parents are well integrated and fluent, mostly in English, sometimes kids feel Persian is not necessary, and they revert to English, which again does not help with language maintenance in the community. And language maintenance is mostly the responsibility of families, which very often results in burnout, parental burnout, because language maintenance is really emotionally draining for parents. It results with conflicts with kids, and hence many parents just give up on language maintenance.
I'm speaking briefly about the many challenges that people who are bilingual and bicultural, which in the case of the Arab world, it's actually multilingual and multicultural. A lot of the kind of going into the historical overview, a lot of it is quite similar to what Ali was talking about in terms of recent waves of immigration. There was really basically no Arabic-speaking community in the US before the late 19th century. And even at that time, mainly those were Christian Arab, members of the Arab Christian community, coming primarily from the Levant area, which includes the Lebanon. The current map of that region is Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Palestine. Later on, starting with the beginning of the 20th century, there was a pretty significant wave from Egypt, later Yemen, and the most recent waves were obviously from Iraq. So basically, very much reflecting the U.S. foreign policy. So whenever there was military involvement, those waves came to the U.S. We have a very interesting geographical spread where the most concentrated area is in Michigan. It's not on the coasts, which that's the usual kind of placement of immigrants. And it's close to Ann Arbor. My alma mater is University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and I will share some of my own personal experiences teaching heritage students, because I had quite a few of them in my classes when I was in graduate school. But it's Dearborn, really, and representing a very interesting mix of different regional groups, including, and primarily those are Egyptians, Palestinians, the Lebanese, and Yemenis. So, in a way, reflecting on the complexity of Middle Eastern internal relationships too. With regard to the challenges that we face. So first of all, Arabic has a pretty unique situation of the formal language, al-Fusha, and the different dialects. So the regional dialects are not, it's not just the colloquial versus formal, it's the multi-regional complexity versus the formal language that is pretty uniform, and it's really the language of the written media, it's the language of literature, and it's the language of political discourse. Even though the latter, especially with the so-called Arab Spring, really the dialects very much entered the political discourse, and given the prominence of social media, they really are, we're kind of witnessing a major shift, sociolinguistic and sociopolitical shift that is happening currently as we speak. With regard to this, this internal complexity, heritage Arabic learners, whether they're first generation or second, or in some cases third generation that know some Arabic from their grandparents, it's not one similar colloquial. Egyptians sound very different from the Moroccans, for example. The Moroccan community is the one that I forgot to mention. There is a pretty significant presence in California, for example. That's their Arabic, their variation of Arabic is really different phonetically, at the very least, and morphologically, because of the influence of the Amazigh or Berber language and the French influences from regions such as Yemen and the Levant. So when you have those students in the classroom, it's really not that you're dealing with informal, versions of the Arabic. You're dealing with the variety of Arabic dialects. With the explosion of interest in the Arabic studies after 9/11, so it had positives and negatives, and I'm speaking specifically about the Arabic learning community and the teachers. First of all, yes, it did generate a lot of interest, and the classes overnight tripled in size. I mean, I was in Michigan at the time, and where we would have about 50% of heritage students in our classes. Prior to that, kind of, the Americans, as we call them in the field, came to study Arabic, which created a problem because we didn't have enough trained, faculty to teach Arabic in general. Forget about the differences of, in the classroom between the heritage and the kind of what do we call them, zero level learners. So that's one complexity. Another one is that we don't have the teaching materials that would address that problem. So we really have, and I speak with confidence, having taught various textbooks, we really have one solid Al-Kitab series that, with a lot of issues too, but there is one textbook that really tries to incorporate those dialects, at least in the very last edition. The most recent edition has Egyptian and the Levantine incorporated. But it's really based on also zero-level learners. It's really not targeting heritage students. So there is an issue of textbooks. In addition to that, when we speak about specifically differences between the MSA, or Modern Standard Arabic, that's sort of the pedagogical way of calling the Fusha, for the sake of textbooks and references. So it's not that, there are, some phonetical and morphological differences. There are very important syntax and grammatical differences too, which also differ between different dialects. So there is the sort of, multiple layers of difficulty. So the challenge of incorporating them, how many minutes do I have? So in terms of incorporating them, just sharing some of the experiences that people have been trying to do. Specifically, we have lesser problems just because of the Arab-speaking community is not significant in the Washington, D.C. and Virginia areas, but the colleagues who teach in New York and New Jersey and, in University of Michigan, so there were different things that people tried to do. In schools where the enrollments are pretty high, there was an attempt to create separate sections for heritage learners, most successfully at the University of Michigan that can afford to do that, which is not always the case, at least in public schools. The other ways of incorporating in meaningful way, the learners, the heritage learners, would be creating speaking groups, kind of groups that would be, we had one of those when I taught at Tufts. It was a spoken word versus written word. So it was kind of tutoring groups that were created with the help of graduate students to sort of level them up a little bit, comparing to the students who are starting Arabic from zero and have certain advantages because of that, because they don't have to overcome the natural language production that is quite different from Al-Fusha. Another really interesting model was tried at I'm blanking the name of the university. It's upstate New York. They created a version of textbook that would incorporate dialect and the formal language, where the students of all levels, including non-heritage students, were taught as if they were studying Arabic in the Arab world, which means that they speak in dialect in class, like normal, the Arabic-speaking child would, and then they read newspapers and they listen to the news in the formal language. So that was a different approach, and this is something that has proven to be the most successful. We currently use a version of that here in our classrooms, even though we have very few heritage students, but that seems to be the most effective way under the circumstances where we cannot teach more than 5 hours a week of integrating this bilingualism that is quite typical to the Arabic-speaking world. And I'll be happy to elaborate more during the discussion. Thank you very much.
We all live in this area, we're familiar with this area, so I will only point out about 2 special characteristics. The DMV area has, according to the census of 2016, residents that have a median age of 36.9 and a median household income around 95,000, which is significantly higher than the median household, as Ali said. However, for Latinos, numbers differ. Median age, it's 26, median income from 26 to 30, depending on the county. We also live in one of the most educated metropolitan areas in the country, with 5.3 residents with at least a bachelor's degree. For Hispanics, it is also one of the most affluent areas and with a highly educated Latino community. So yes, the DMV has highly educated Latinos more than Florida, New York, California, not within cities, but as a metropolitan area. We also have disparities, as we all know. We are in a region where we have international, governmental, and humanitarian organizations together with a very recent immigrant group. Starting in the 1980s, the area received thousands of refugees from Central America, fleeing both civil wars and natural disasters, who joined earlier immigrants, mostly women, working as domestic employees for diplomatic and international staff in the area. While the majority of these immigrants initially moved into certain neighborhoods in the District of Columbia, many of them finally dispersed to suburban areas both in Maryland and Virginia. Salvadorians are the largest group of immigrants in the Washington, D.C. area, surpassing Mexicans, Cuban, and even Puerto Ricans. Now, let's talk about the specific and quite diverse features of the Spanish spoken in this area, which is different from the West, the Northeast, etc. We have three larger varieties of Spanish. We have the Central American Spanish, we have Mexican Spanish, we have the Caribbean Spanish, and all other varieties. So we have all varieties around, which is certainly an asset for our students. Another important consideration about the Spanish spoken here concerns negative attitudes towards particular varieties of Spanish coming from within the Latino communities, such as a negative view of the recent immigrants coming from certain countries or regions, the disregard toward Spanish spoken by people of lower social status, Central Americans coming from rural regions with relatively low levels of formal education, and of course, the contempt that some heritage speakers experience when trying to overcome their lack of fluency in Spanish. These negative attitudes have a lot to do with the already described internal diversity in origin, social class, and socioeconomic status of the Latinos in the DMV area, where we have, on the one end, many Spanish speakers from a range of national origins working at embassies, international banks, organizations, research universities, and humanitarian institutions. On the other hand, the community has a rather high number of first-generation immigrants with either undocumented or temporary legal status, the TPS. We have around 38,000 mostly Salvadorians who might be deported next year when this program ends. We also have the DACA kids, Deferred Action of Childhood Arrivals. In this area we have about 20,000, and we also have the unaccompanied children. In Montgomery County we had an increase of 44% of the students enrolled. Actually from the 2013 to the 2015 school years, we had 16,000 new enrollments in Montgomery County and almost 1,900 in the PG County. We find this second group working in housekeeping or repair services, child or elderly care, hospitality industry, restaurants, landscaping, you name it, we're there. So it is not difficult to imagine that the socioeconomic and educational realities of Spanish speakers for these groups are very different. While for some, knowing and learning Spanish constitutes an essential part of their social and cultural capital, that often involves traveling back and forth from their countries of origin, for others, speaking or learning Spanish may entail lack of professional or social opportunities, negative attitudes, and even marginalization. Regarding our heritage language programs in the DMV, we have around 84 institutions serving, and they range from community-based schools, and this is also the same around the nation, Community-based schools developed by families, churches, community organizations like the Escuela Argentina and so on. We have K-12 education, both private and public, that range from immersion programs, dual programs, courses for just heritage learners, and mixed groups with L2 learners and heritage learners. And in higher education, we have, like in here, separate courses for heritage speakers, and at the upper level, we have a mix of L2 and heritage learners together. We believe, we here at the Spanish department, that courses and programs for heritage speakers should be designed and revised, taking into account the social and linguistic factors already mentioned. Teachers and administrators should make a conscious effort for validating and incorporating these varieties of Spanish spoken in by our students. Such an effort would require teachers to participate as well as engage students in the process of discovering and addressing the implicit linguistic ideologies that may limit learning and teaching of Spanish to standard, prestigious, or hegemonic varieties. From a curricular perspective, this goal could be achieved within a framework of critical pedagogy by reflecting, among other topics, on the factors that intervene in the legitimization of a variety over others, the meaning of what a correct Spanish is, and the social, linguistic, and socioeconomic situation of students and their communities. In this area, regarding curriculum, geographical location, placement of Spanish heritage courses, we have found that courses are very dispersed, and this is problematic for several reasons. First, there is lack of continuity from one educational level to another, elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, and then higher education, either due to a reduced number of course offerings or to a drastic change in terms of goals and teaching approaches. Second, within the same educational level, each institution has a different understanding of what dual immersion program is, or what Spanish heritage classes entail, and thus pedagogical approach and learning goals vary very widely. Third, institutions offering courses that address the needs of Spanish heritage learners are concentrated in certain geographical areas, limiting access to these programs to specific areas. And fourth, and we see this here, a growing number of heritage learners begin their academic experience in heritage language courses without any kind of writing skills or knowledge of formal registers in the language, and or a low oral proficiency level. In order to address these issues, it is our recommendation to form, the original seed of why we're here, a county-wide regional consortium of heritage language practitioners, including teachers, academics, administrators, and community leaders, to serve as a clearinghouse that shares resources, best practices, and facilitates networking and community outreach. Such an organization should also offer professional development opportunities at different institutions in the area and promote service learning projects to strengthen the collaboration between institutions and community. An essential step would entail the design and implementation of placement and assessment criteria and instruments, as well as curricular guidelines to align course offering at the same educational level across institutions, guaranteeing continuity and accessibility from one educational level to the other. Because people move from Maryland to Virginia to DC back and forth all the time. With this reflection in mind, to better serve the Hispanic population adequately, it is necessary to foster the involvement and connection with the local communities. This means involving heritage language programs and learners in coalitions or alliances with community partners, institutions, and agencies in community-based initiatives from which both students and communities can learn from each other and collaborate to achieve coordinated goals. If Spanish heritage language programs are to be successful, students need to engage with the language in the community. And there are several ways to do that I'm sure that we'll be talking about today and tomorrow. Thank you.
I remember Roberta since the days when we worked on that MA in second language acquisition and then administered that MA. And I can tell you that Roberta stood out of this team of faculty because she had this amazing positive energy, and she was able to come up with brilliant solutions to all kinds of very, very complex problems that we were dealing with at the time. Yes, Roberta. And I was very happy to meet some of the graduates of this master's program here in the room. So that was time well spent. And thank you for all your professional leadership that you provided. So I'm going to talk about heritage. I don't think I can handle it this way. About heritage, Russian heritage speakers, and I'll tell you why I am a faculty member in the second language acquisition program these days. But I had taught for many years in the Russian program, and I have different kinds of connections to heritage speakers. I taught them in my classroom. I did research on them. I am teaching a graduate level course on heritage speakers on a regular basis in our program there. I have friends among them. I have family members, like my son is a canonical heritage speaker, so on all kinds of levels. So there is a big Russian community in the United States, and with the largest population concentrated in the New York City area, and specifically at Brighton Beach, where they say approximately 1 million Russian speakers live. Well, altogether in the New York City area, including Brighton Beach. And the community around Brighton Beach has its specifics that is not probably the same as the specifics of the community around this area. So people, Russian families, Russian-speaking families in the Brighton Beach community very often come from different parts of Russia or from different former republics of the Soviet Union, which means that they speak very different regional varieties of Russian. So there is, the spread of dialects, if you want, in the families is great. Not all parents have college education around Brighton Beach. And they do try to speak Russian to their children. But there is no, as far as I know, there is no such a culture of sending children to say, a Sunday school and enforcing formal education. So a typical heritage speaker around the University of Maryland. Let's see if I can play the video for you. So it goes on and on. You've got the picture. Sergey Brin is one of the graduates of the University of Maryland, and if you want the best prototype of a heritage speaker, in a sense that he is professionally accomplished, he moved to the United States around the critical period. So I wanted, the next thing I wanted to do is play a short video clip where he speaks in English. I also have one in Russian, but it's not going to be very informative. But for the English one, just I wanted to gauge your impression whether he has at least an accent when he speaks English.
Hi. How would you say that Google Wave today reflects how Google innovates?
That's not him.
I think Google Wave is really remarkable in many ways because it takes a number of things that we were previously doing, different forms of communication, whether it's Gmail, Google Talk, even Google Docs for interaction, all those capabilities, but yet develops them in a completely different way. And I think that there are not many.
What do you say? Is there a slight accent? Yes.
Light, yeah.
I hear it because I hear some words that are pronounced the Russian way.
Yes.
And this is a very, very interesting reflection, by the way, on heritage speakers. He certainly speaks Russian in a non-native way, though he's very fluent in Russian. He can express himself. I would say he's probably an advanced speaker. But he is not completely native in English either, though his language is very rich, at least at the level of accent. You can still hear traces of accent. So just to summarize the pattern of heritage speakers around the University of Maryland and this area. Many more families have moved from the mainland, from Russia, and therefore the level of variability in terms of regional variance is much less. A lot of parents have professional education, and they try to maintain the language of their children by organizing after-school programs, Sunday schools. There are plenty of them in the area. As to the heritage speakers, they do not necessarily make Russian their major. They are focused on other majors, but from time to time they take courses in the Russian program for different reasons. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and show you one of the results of our big project on heritage speakers. That is a part of a truly big project, but I'll show you one effect that we have observed in Russian heritage speakers compared to late learners of Russian. And it would be interesting to gauge your intuitions or maybe your knowledge about whether this could be generalized to heritage speakers of other languages. So in a nutshell, we created a big grammatic elegy judgment test, and we split it in two halves. One half of it was presented auditorily and the other visually. Exactly same 10 Russian features, the toughest. And we had a group of heritage speakers, late learners, and native Russian controls. So this was part of a bigger project funded by Duke University and UCLA, the Heritage Language Center. We're very thankful for the funding to both institutions. The prediction, based on what we know about heritage speakers. Heritage speakers receive native input from birth, from their caregivers. They do not necessarily have formal education, especially at a younger age. They do not necessarily go to grade school. Late learners do not have native input early, and when the window of opportunity that closes, supposedly closes with the critical period, when the critical period is over, they do not get it. But they get a lot of formal education and rules and explicit training in grammar and all kinds of things. So our predictions initially were that heritage speakers will outperform late learners on the auditory modality, but they will be outperformed by late formal learners on the visual modality. And we OPI'd them. We had a spread of proficiencies, and here are the results in a nutshell. This graph, it has two parts. On the left, the accuracy rate in the grammatical condition, and on the right, on the ungrammatical condition. First of all, the first take-home message is never look at the grammatical condition. Everybody is stealing, and it doesn't show a lot of variability. They're pretty much doing the same thing. So the most informative part is ungrammatical, and there you see the red line, heritage speakers, is much higher than the green line for late learners. So you look at this picture and you say, oh, we balanced those two groups on the OPI, but heritage speakers are doing better. So now let's look what happens when we split them into auditory and visual. So again, it's organized slightly differently. So the left top is grammatical auditory, the right top is grammatical visual, nothing is going on there. The interesting place is the ungrammatical condition. Ungrammatical auditory on the left, you see a big separation. And ungrammatical visual, in fact, you don't. So the take-home message is that heritage speakers in our sample, and these are Russian heritage speakers, did indeed outperform late learners in the auditory modality, but they did not outperform them in the visual modality, which was a very interesting result for us. And we can talk more about it, and of course I'm very interested to hear about other languages, but apparently this has to do with the sampling of heritage speakers that we had. These are not people from Brighton Beach. These are people who read and write well, even though they may not have had a lot of formal education. So in the Russian program, what kinds of courses do heritage speakers get enrolled in? All levels of Russian except the introductory course, the beginner course of Russian 101, 102. Literature and culture courses taught in English. There they would be together with the non-heritage speakers. I taught a course, and that was a course from hell, I need to tell you, but I still remember it because it was a very rewarding course in the end. It was a course on film, building a new reality, Russian cinema at the turn of the millennium, and it had two sections who met at the same time, but they had two different syllabi, the same list of movies, but different readings, one in English, the other in Russian, and I had graduate assistants, native speakers of Russian, graduate students in the program, who conducted a discussion group with heritage speakers while I was working in English with our students in the Russian program who were not able to discuss things in Russian because some of them actually didn't speak English at all before. So we had that. The interesting part, why it was a rewarding course, you would say that's nonsensical. The interesting part was the end of the class when the two groups came together and we had two perspectives because they would summarize the perspectives from two groups, and it was obvious that they had a very different cultural vision. They noted different things. They were doing different readings, so they focused on different things. So in the end, it was a wonderful course. And we offer sub-courses specifically geared for heritage speakers. How are we doing? Okay, so one of the courses that the Russian program offers from time to time is the language heritage course in Russian, and then we use the textbook Russian for Russians. by a team of authors led by Olga Kagan, a good friend and colleague who just passed away, unfortunately. My son took this class, and I can tell you he was rated as a barely superior speaker in Russian at the time, but he had never had any formal education, and he came home and he said, "Mother, what are those cases? What does it mean at all? We are talking about 6 cases in Russian. What is it?" So apparently it's a very useful course. And the last thing I wanted to tell you about was a very fun course, the last heritage language course that I taught in the Russian program. I taught it in 2005. It was based on a 15-episode Russian crime TV series about Russian mafia, if you want. And you can, the title is The Brigade, or in English it was circulated as Law of the Lawless. And you can see from the jacket of the DVDs, on the left, you see 4 good friends, young people, bright eyes, ready for the future. And on the right, you see 3 mafia people, and you actually don't see the godfather, the one in the green jacket, because apparently he had some good features. He was a little bit like the Sopranos character. The video focused a lot on the family that's hurt, the friendships that are destroyed in the relations among those people in the mafia. But why I think it was a very interesting course? First of all, I taught it because a colleague of mine shared a set of absolutely unique materials that she put together for this course. She not only did she have a full transcript translated and all the criminal slang translated with citations from the newest dictionaries, she prepared a CD that was around those times with all the cultural references presented as video clips. And this series is interesting in 2 respects. Number one, it uses a range of registers and styles, including this obviously criminal slang, but not just that. But also it's full of cultural associations and allusions and hidden citations. And if you don't live in this culture, or you're not from that generation, you don't get it. It's just a dialect. But if you if you have those places highlighted, you see that there are hidden citations everywhere, and it plays puns on Soviet stereotypes all the time with the language. So what I did with this course, it was a course in stylistics as well as on cinema. And we would have some theoretical introduction into stylistics, and then I would develop their meta-linguistic and metacultural knowledge and their sense of those gaps between how they hear the text and how they should try to dig deeper and do a little bit of research and find out what's below the surface. Maybe a citation from a Soviet song, or an allusion to a cartoon character, anything. So that was a fun course to teach. Now, I wanted to add with a question to my colleagues and to the audience about teaching heritage speakers. What are the pros and cons of placing them together with late learners in one classroom? Or alternatively, what are the pros and cons of a separate heritage track Of course, here we're having a highbrow discussion. We're not talking about petty issues like the funding, to support this track. So, I'm interested in your feedback in terms of an ideal situation, not about where to get the money to fund this track, because that's the big question. Okay, thank you very much.
Different from hers is that she has a lot of her experience. I have mine, but hers is higher education. Mine is lower education, K to 12, let's say. And I really appreciate that this symposium, although it says DC, Maryland, Virginia, in Spanish on there. You covered all different languages. I really appreciate that. And just to let everybody know, my former life, my studies is in German. So Chinese is not my field. However, I do have experience in teaching Chinese schools. I believe that's why Manel invited me. So historical perspective, talking about Chinese is the second most common foreign language spoken by those living in the U.S. following Spanish. And that is based on Census Bureau of 2000, I believe still is the case and much stronger, because in 2008, an estimate of 2 million already speak in Chinese. Today, I believe is even doubled. And in Canada, exactly the same thing. That is the census of 2001. I could only get this old data. So followed by English and French is the third one. And the first, since we want to talk about this area, I want to share with you the first ever Chinese heritage language school was founded in the 80s in Potomac, and started with less than 50 students. It's just like these families, they say, why don't we have one? And then the parents started that. They didn't have any idea how a school is supposed to be, and they started. And then when I joined in 1997, I joined one of the 6 schools in this area. Each one of school has 100 to 300 students to serve families of diasporas of Taiwan. Remember that time, we didn't have too many mainland. And even mainland, very low number, they would join our school and then learn this traditional characters. And now there are 23 schools. Yeah, in DC we have 2, and Northern Virginia 5, Maryland even 16, and some have over 700 students in one school. And all these schools, they rent public school spaces to run their Sunday schools. And if you hear that one of the schools is over, say, 300, 400, 500, they are mainlanders. They started those schools. And as I said, the newer ones, they teach simplified characters, those traditional characters by older schools, the ones among them I teach. And some of my TAs then, their children already in the school age. And then I say, hey, which Chinese school do you take your students to? The mainland one. You say, traditional one is too hard for my children to learn. So I want them to have an easier way. I say, they are children, if you, it doesn't matter. They say, easier is better for my children. So that is the trend. Very interesting one. Although my brother, for example, he has a factory in China. I'm from Taiwan. And then when he asked his local manager, now it's packaged for our product. How should we use, which language should I use? I'm from Taiwan, I have traditional. And then here is in China. And then the local manager said, print the traditional one. They know that this is from Taiwan, it's better. So that is, I don't understand. When he told me that, I found this very interesting. And we call social linguistic things. I want to share with you all my experiences. I taught at this Washington School of Language and Culture, which is not in Washington at all. It was in Rockville. It's still there. And I taught from 1997 until 2010. So in addition to my job here on Saturdays, 23 years over there. I wanted to, after my children graduated, I wanted to leave, and then I couldn't. Just didn't. So I thank Gabi Strauss so much, because she sent me to Germany to teach a whole semester there. So I finally say goodbye to the school. And they had to let me go. So in this school, they have language classes for 2 hours, and then culture class for 1 hour. Although I say K to 12, it's K1, K2, K3. So totally 15 grades. Yeah. And culture classes. I like this school because they don't only teach language, they teach culture as well. So there are a lot of, you can read the things, they teach songs, craft, movies, games, all these things. In high school, I included history, geography, philosophy, Chinese medicine, karate, tai chi, choir. All those I just dumped into students because I know one day they will understand why we taught them that. And then, of course, teaching those, we have to use bilingual because they won't be able to understand. So we kind of take back a little bit so that they do know the cultural part. And in the school, there is also a lot of extracurricular activities before school, during the school, and after the school. During the school is for parents. So it's really very socially, very very close-knit society, so to say. Every Sunday, so many families, they are together there. And as you can see, dragon boat, lion dance, Chinese opera, yoga, karate, qigong. Oh, I write that because after teaching language, I teach them qigong and tai chi. The parents, and they want to do that. So Sunday is always full. Was always full. And that school first used textbooks provided by the Taiwanese government for free. They gave the books, but now, see, I intentionally put grammatic error. So now they ordered, supposed to be, now they order from bookstore after I left. And the reason is, they gave you the book exactly what they use in Taiwan. So 14 years old, they have only second grade capacity of learning. They have to read that ridiculous childish book. It didn't work. So I told them, no way. So when I was there, I kind of followed my own children's development. And when they were in grade school, I taught grade school and changed all their curriculum. And then from one level to the other, what I did, I even wrote 4 grades high school textbooks for them to use, created in 4 years, 4 books. And then, yeah, it's, you know, in Chinese, they say everything does things for themselves. Very selfish intention. I did that for my children. I share that with the whole school. So that is a good thing. Yeah. And I also attended regional and also U.S. National Language School Association conferences and share ideas, share the books I wrote with them. Because I'm a positive person, I thought if we can just let everybody know there's a better way to teach, and that is better. And also for families and students, they come to Chinese school, I always tell them, you are doing the right thing. this is to put a seed into children's mind or ignite a spark, right? You never know how it will be grow into a tree or it will be a raging fire. You never know. But we want to give them this opportunity. Yeah. So, the pedagogical challenges, some of them already mentioned earlier. Mixed feelings for students to come to school. Once they hate it, extra study, extra homework, and less time for their Chinese project or Chinese friends. However, they love to come. Some of them really do, and because they can see their friends in the same culture. And then it is actually not an immersion school because English still will be used among students and even to their parents. Sometimes I see some of them, if they talk in Chinese to their parents, I always smile to them. And I always listen to how parents reply to the students. If they speak in Chinese, I pat their shoulder. If they speak in English, they get a lecture from me. I say, you dump your children 3 hours to us and expect them to learn Chinese if you don't talk to them? Yeah, they are on probation. Yeah, and I really do that. I believe I'm not Chinese anymore. I told some of my colleagues I mixed my German identity to it. I'm very strict and very direct. Sometimes I'm so blunt that people cannot stand me. And the challenge is it's very hard to find those suitable curriculum, just like Arabic just mentioned in the beginning. But now, as I said, I went to every year I went to conference, and then I saw some of the sold books. They used my idea. I was quite happy. Yeah. And my husband said, "Don't you want some money to share with you?" I said, "No." Yeah. And the other one is teachers. Teacher training is not standardized. Some of the teachers, I have to train them to even pronounce correctly. So there is many challenges in this school system. However, as I said, I'm a positive person. I thought heritage schools, they provide a very valuable environment to family to practice the culture. So sometimes my own children will say, "Hey, Mom, do you still remember today is what festival?" I said, "Oh, because in the American calendar, you forget even the New Year's," and they remember. And for me, that is something treasure. And the last one is, after teaching, finished teaching Chinese school, I sometimes see my former students in humanities. They are then taking college courses. So the seed did grow. So that's all what I have to share. Thank you.
Say some things. You may have noticed that I'm not Korean, but what I have to tell you about are some things that are parallels with the other language programs and even Spanish. I learned a little bit about it from you. Actually, I think it was Fabian who's told me, because I asked him, I said, in Korean and Japanese, we know perfectly well what language to teach, the standard language. I said, what do they do in Spanish? And I knew that you did Latin American Spanish, but I said, which one? I know enough that there's different. So I asked Fabian, and he said, "Oh, it's easy. The person just teaches whatever language they grew up with." And I said, "Well, what does Roberta Levine teach?" and he said, "Oh, that's easy. It's New Yorkino." So that's another thing. That is absolutely true. That was it Fabian? I think it was Fabian. In any case, what I wanted to talk about is just a little bit about heritage, and then mention something else that Kira really brought up briefly, but I think it's an enormous problem that often goes under the radar unnoticed. What I want to talk about a little bit about the program. We've had Korean taught. I started Korean back in 1988. And in the beginning, it was completely heritage. They were flowing out the door. They were all heritage students, anxious to learn the language of their heritage, and it went like that for about 10 years. And then in 1998, we started the two-track system. The two-track system was one in which we actually completely separated heritage speakers from non-heritage speakers. Heritage speakers would intimidate. When they got into a regular classroom, they completely intimidated the other kids, and so I think we did the right thing. That system lasted from 1999 until last year, until 2016. Now we don't have the heritage track right now. That is to say, what happened? Well, first of all, there's a bit of less demand. There are 1 million Koreans living here in the United States, and the number of immigrants from South Korea has dropped off since 2010. It's leveled off. It's really leveled. Before that, after 1965, it climbed very rapidly, and then it leveled off. And so there aren't as many. There aren't as many as before. And there are fewer first-generation speakers and what the Koreans call 1.5-generation speakers. Those who were born in Korea come here as young children, hovering around the critical period, not quite clear when they're coming. Those kids are becoming fewer, and by the time you get to this, we know what happens. By the time you get to second and third generations, it's the same thing that happens in Japan. We know it happens in Japanese. The people of Japanese heritage are just normal language learners for the most part. So there is that, but there's something else that happened, and that is that the non-heritage demand for Korean has absolutely exploded with the rise of K-pop and K-drama. All of these factors have made Korean into a worldwide demand, and so yeah, we've got kids over there now. They've been, working on their moves, and they have a K-pop dance troupe. Yeah, these kids, they're from all over. Some of them might even say wearing a hijab and stuff. It's just incredible, this kind of thing. So that this has just gone through the roof. And so we went from a section of 101. Suddenly we have to have 3, and it doesn't let us have the freedom to offer heritage track separately. But as Richard Brecht said, really, their needs are so different. It's not good to mix them. So I think we still have this enormous problem. There aren't as many, and Youngie and I, she is at such a loss for what to do with these kids who can speak some, they sound good, but they're not just, the American kids think that there's native speakers. They're not. There is something else, and they're much more in need in some ways than the non-heritage speakers, because they have a hard time in Korean society because they are expected to know more. It really is emotionally draining for these kids. So we have this need for it, but we don't have the resources because we're busy stocking the kids who are just come in, they're shaking, they're so happy about K-pop or whatever the hell it is. I mean, look, I don't know anything about it because I'm too old, I guess, but they just love this stuff, and they can be of all ethnicities. But what we know is that Korean in the last MLA report is by far and away the fastest growing language being taught in the United States. In the last 3 years, it's risen by something like 14%. It's an enormous. And Japanese and Korean were the only 2 languages. Yeah. Everything else dipped, which is concerning. But Korean has this kind of cachet worldwide. So there is this enormous demand. And I want to find out how in the world we can salvage something for heritage speakers, because they are in dire need of something, and it's not possible really to accommodate them in the usual language sections in any realistic way. As Kira said, the thing is, they sound much better, but their mastery of trying to use more sophisticated language and writing especially, they lag behind the other learners. It's quite an amazing phenomenon to me. But one of the things I want to raise is something that I am not an expert in, but I want to put out to you and say that it's something that needs thought and research, extensive research on something. I know there's controversy, linguistic controversy about it, but there's something that when I was finishing up my graduate career this was back around 1975, there was something that they brought up called semilingualism. Now, semilingualism is a loaded term and people are not happy with it, but the contention is that, and what people call bilinguals, people note that there's surface fluency in both language, but mastery of neither one. And it's not something that's easily quantifiable and dealt with. This is something that I am not an expert in, but over 30, 40 years of teaching kids, I can tell you that, at least anecdotally, it is really a deep-rooted problem. And it's deceptive because I listen to these kids in my classes. They're eloquent, they speak English. I can't tell that they're not just normal native-born Americans. But then I assign them or give them a writing assignment, and it's filled with mistakes, and not just the ordinary, Americans are illiterate anyway, they're gonna make mistakes, but these kids are not like that. They make mistakes that you would see in Chinese or Korean communities. They have odd things. I noticed one of them, I just read some notes about it. They wrote, "It deadlines on June 31st. Now that's not idiomatic English according to me. Or so one once asked me, she said, "Is it North Pole or is it the North Pole?" She didn't know. You can't find a native speaker of English who doesn't know which it is. Or, this is good, he married with a German. What native speaker would ever say that?
Wait, is it the North Pole or is it... Just to get it straight.
I went to North Pole. Here he went to, was it South Pole or North Pole? I can't remember. But you have to know articles, and they get them wrong. I don't know why I don't notice it when they're speaking, but it nevertheless is a reality that they don't know. What I want to say to you is that these kids, and let me not forget to say, that's with English. So the Americans, if you talk to them, they just think, oh, okay, they're just Koreans or they're Chinese or something. But they don't know Korean. Their mastery of Korean or Chinese is far, far below that. They really don't know those languages. They just they have a surface fluency, but they don't speak it. They don't write it. They make all kinds of strange errors. Youngie goes nuts looking at some of their composition. She says, why can't they do, she says, they don't learn as well as the kids who start as tabula rasa, come in just as a blank slate. They do these things better. I'm saying to you that it is a critical problem, and heritage communities are filled with these kids that I hardly know how to deal with them. I'm not an expert, but I'm saying to you that this is a problem that we need to do some research and to think about and try to address, because it is real. This underscores, in my view, even more the need for concentrating on heritage language instruction. Heritage speakers need to be given some kind of consideration and special attention. You cannot just simply merge them for economic reasons and expect to have a good outcome. It doesn't work that way, folks. We're concerned about, are we just concerned about money, or do we care about pedagogy? Do we care about having something productive? I would tend to argue that we should at least think about this problem and try to work on it more. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and please think about that and help me out.
Really,
we, but not necessarily in the same way as the other heritage speakers. So if you look at US Census Bureau data, these are the French speakers in the United States. So you see things that you expect, like, well, first of all, there's about 1.3 million of them. That's only 0.4% of the US population over the age of 5, but the French group makes up 2% of all those who speak a language other than English at home. So you expect to see them in Louisiana, and there they are. You might not expect to see them in Maine. Do people know that there's a very large group of French speakers in Maine? In fact, the French heritage speakers in Maine are about 1/3 of them grew up natively speaking French of not French origin, but
Québécois.
Yeah, Acadian origin. There is also something that I learned recently, I didn't know. There is a community in Harlem called Little Senegal because there are so many Senegalese immigrants in that area. And there are a bunch of, that's a very scientific term, a bunch of French speakers in Florida, both Haitians in Miami and in Fort Lauderdale, and on the West Coast you actually have a large number of retired French Canadians who moved down to Florida at least for the winter, which in their experience is quite a long period of time. So what does Washington do in all of that? Well, in our region, in the DMV, there are almost 60,000 French speakers, and that number goes up higher if you add French Creole speakers. You might not really want to add French Creole speakers because French Creole is not French, it's a separate language. And that's about 1.1% of the DMV population, so not that much. But in this area, it's a significant number of, I think it might actually be the 3rd language behind Spanish and Chinese, home language spoken in this particular region. So, where do UMD students come from? So taking it even more local, is here you have, unfortunately, as I tried to get some data on this, but Maryland does not collect any data on the home languages spoken by its students. So if you try to get that data from the Maryland data people, you can't get it because they don't collect it yet. But they did send me this helpful graph of where the foreign students are. So you see the foreign students, and everything that is highlighted in yellow would represent places where we could expect to get French heritage speakers. So those are countries where one of the official languages or the language of education is French. I did not highlight Belgium, Canada, Switzerland, and France because in those languages it's a different population. In those languages we wouldn't call those foreign students who come to UMD from those countries are not heritage speakers, they're just native speakers of that language, of French. So what are the characteristics of the heritage French speakers in our area? First characteristic is quite a significant number of them come from African countries. And so this makes it a unique population because actually French is not their first language, right? So we're calling them heritage language speakers, and they have a large number of characteristics that they share with heritage language speakers, but it's not their native language. It's not their first language. It's the language of education. So they're also very frequently multilingual. Africa is a place of enormous multilingualism. So it would be frequently the case that a student, say from Cameroon, might have, or very frequently would have, parents who have 2 different native languages, but the language of home, quote unquote, that the parents have in common might be French. And so they would be speaking that language, and the child would grow up learning spoken French. You can't really, Evelyn did a great job of talking about how in this area the socioeconomic status of the heritage speakers varies quite a bit. So you have the one highly educated population where you have diplomats, you have people working for IMF, World Bank, so on and so forth, a very different status. Then also you have, and then you also have a large African immigrant population, both from Anglophone countries and Francophone countries in this area. And by and large, that is an educated group. So you're not getting the African students or students of African origin who are our heritage speakers are not first generation college students by and large. But then you do also have some refugee populations, not so many in our area, but in other areas of the country you do have some refugee populations. Interestingly, in Louisiana and Maine, which are not the DMV, I understand that, but anyways, historically and interestingly speaking, in Louisiana and Maine, you do have an older population who are native speakers of a Northern American variety of French, and that's usually a 60-plus group. So it's the older speakers. And in those areas, you have programs that are called French Heritage Language Programs, which are really trying to reintroduce the language, right? And to either, in a lot of cases, it's not really even language maintenance. There's an ethnic link, there's a cultural link to the language, but they're teaching it as pretty much a foreign language. There is an official program started in New York and run out of New York in partnership with the Cultural Services of the French Embassy. So you can see, yes, I do have a little pointer. So in New York, you can see here's the group of New York heritage speakers are by and large. The students in this program are of African descent largely, and they have all kinds of different programs. It started with one, and now they're all over New York. I don't have all the I don't remember all the figures of how many they have, but they vary from programs that they actually have gotten integrated right into the school curriculum to programs where they're after school and community center type programs. There's a program run from the Malian Cultural Center and the Senegalese Cultural Center, and also programs really where they've worked with the school system and they have them right as part of the class offerings. In Maine, I think this picture is wonderful because you see some of the older population of native French speakers, and in Maine there is also a large number of, or a significant number of recent immigrants and refugee populations that have a different relationship to the language. And then in Miami you have after-school programs. So I wanted to talk a little bit about when we talk about heritage speakers in SLLC, what are we talking about? Well, they're usually in the third semester and above. Very rarely, we get some in the beginning levels. We try not to have them in the beginning languages, but sometimes they're sneaky and we don't find them when we should. And as people probably know, one of the reasons that we don't like them in the beginning language is what you've heard from other people, is they sound like they're native speakers. Sometimes they are pretty much indistinguishable from native speakers, and sometimes to a learner who doesn't know very much, they sound like they're native speakers. But usually although they are literate, they're usually not literate in French, which gives them all kinds of problems. Typically in any given semester we have, I've never heard of, and I polled all the faculty, I never heard of more than 3 students any given semester in any given class. And mostly, the students we call French heritage speakers are of African descent. Some are French, actually, and my colleagues are going to call anybody a heritage speaker. My definition would be a little bit stricter, so that someone who is here from France but who did a significant part of their education in France or in the DC area at the Lycée Rochambeau, for example, which is a regular French lycée run by the French Ministry of Education. I'm not going to classify that person as a heritage speaker because they have had scolarisation, or what is that, schooling in French. But there are cases of French families or Belgian families, Swiss families who live in this area, whose kids go to school here, they don't go to French schools, and so they grow up hearing French and speaking French at home, but they don't go to Sunday schools or any of those kinds of things. So In a linguistic profile, they are usually fluent speakers. They have excellent oral comprehension. They have frequent difficulties in written expression. And then we have this special case in French. I classify them as French heritage speakers, even though their profile is very different. These are the kids who went through the French immersion programs. They have a kind of French that I call immersion French, which is very different than French. But again, they have a spoken fluidity in the language. They can say anything. They can get their meaning across. If you are a fluent native speaker of French, it doesn't sound very much like French. The accent might be perfect, but it doesn't, and it might not be, but it doesn't sound like French. If you know what you're doing, if you don't know what you're doing, it sounds like French. And they're they have a very high communicative threshold. And they also can have significant problems in writing. So that's another group that we deal with. But again, it's just a few per class. One of the big problems we have is French has something that I'm calling grammatical homophony, which means all these words sound alike. So this is actually a written production of a heritage speaker. And those words in red, if you read it out loud, it's perfect. But that's what those forms should be. And so what this student has done is written an infinitive instead of a participle, and has used the third person singular form of to be instead of the preposition. So you read it out loud, no problem, but unless you read it out loud, you have a problem. And to give you an example of this, in French, the verb parler, or it's not even a verb, just this string, parler, can mean all these different things. So it really matters. All these written endings matter, but you don't hear them. And these heritage speakers can write anything because they're just writing, what they hear. Another example is été, which not only has a whole lot of verbal morphology, it can also be a noun to mean summer. So, for example, for the correct form, j'ai été, you could get something like this, j'étais, or j'ai été, or j'ai. I mean, the possibilities are really infinite, and I've seen them all. And if you teach French, I know there's just a couple people I know teach French, maybe others do, you've seen them too. The final thing that I'm not really going to give you examples of is, of course, other people have mentioned, they have problems with register. So for example, they don't necessarily know what's formal, what's informal, what you can say, but you really shouldn't be writing. Immersion kids have a lot of problems with that too. And then in grammatical agreements, just by what I've shown you, if you don't know anything about French, you might be able to guess that most French agreements are seen but not heard. So because they're not heard, heritage speakers are going to miss them. Et voilà.
Hi, my name is Etsuko Yamakita, and I've been a coordinator for Japanese placement test in recent years. And from this experience, I would like to talk about problems and future issues of Japanese heritage language speakers. Many of the Japanese and those of Japanese descent in the United States live in Hawaii and California. But according to the last US census in 2010, there are about 17,000 Japanese and Japanese descent in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. Prior to 2000, Washington Japanese Language School, which is K-12, was the only Japanese educational institution in this area. It was founded in 1958. Initially, this school was for the children of diplomats working at the Japanese embassy and was started as a supplement to the Japanese school curriculums. And currently, classes are held on Saturday from 9:30 to 3:30. Students study Japanese, mathematics, music, physical education, natural science, and social science in Japanese at each grade level, using the same textbooks used in Japan. The Japanese government financially supports this school. In the period from 1980 to 1990, as the Japanese economy developed, the number of Japanese expatriate families increased. Approximately 500 students enrolled, and 90% of them were children of Japanese expatriate families. Only 10 to 15% of students were children of families who permanently live here. As the Japanese economy weakened and the number of Japanese expatriates decreased, the number of students also decreased. However, since around 2000, interest in Japanese language as a heritage language has begun to rise among permanent or long-term residents. Currently, there are approximately 700 students. Heritage language speakers account for 70%. New problems will arise as heritage language speakers increase. This problem is also the fundamental problem of Japanese language education. It stems from a complex orthography in Japanese. There are 3 writing systems in Japanese, 48 hiragana and 48 katakana, and kanji Chinese characters. Daily use is 3,000. In the dictionary, it has like about 50,000. And in elementary school, a student learned 1,006 kanji Chinese characters. The mastery of kanji from grades 3 to 4 makes a huge difference in reading and writing. In another word, lack of kanji skills create an inability to read and write Japanese language skills. The problem is the so-called 9-year-old wall. Heritage language speakers can acquire everyday conversational language. However, since they do not have enough literacy skills due to lack of kanji knowledge, they fail to learn Japanese as a learning language, which is different from everyday conversational Japanese. It is necessary to master that learning language to understand and express abstract ideas and abstract matters. If they do not master the learning language, they cannot understand abstract concepts. Because of this, heritage language learners tend to give up learning Japanese. From around 2000, in response to the request of heritage speakers who face such a problem, 3 Japanese Saturday kindergarten and 1 heritage Japanese Saturday school were founded in this area. Washington Japanese Language School also started classes based on the student Japanese ability. Among the students of the heritage language speakers who take the placement test at the University of Maryland, the same problem can be seen. And 9 out of 12 heritage language speakers who took the placement test in the past 2 to 3 years had this problem. They have daily conversational skills, but they are not able to read and write due to lack of kanji, Chinese character knowledge. In other words, they didn't acquire the learning language. Therefore, they cannot understand and express the abstract idea and abstract concept. Unfortunately, the two students were determined that there was no suitable class for them to take at University of Maryland. For those students, it is important to improve reading and writing skills through learning kanji. By improving reading and writing skills, they can acquire the learning language and can understand and express abstract ideas. For those students, classes focusing on kanji, reading, and writing are vital. There are short description of my experience at Washington Japanese Language School and as a placement coordinator at University of Maryland. There are, of course, many challenges for heritage Japanese language learners who wish to learn the language of their ancestries. However, I believe our challenge is not only how we will meet the needs of these Japanese language heritage learners, but how our university can meet the needs of this diverse international language community.